Bonjour, c'est vraiment un plaisir pour moi d'être ici en Colombie-Britannique. My presentation will be in English. I'd like to start by thanking the Musqueam First Nation for hosting us here today. It's very bright up here, so I can't actually see anybody, so I assume there's people out there. Good. Thanks very much. Thank you. Merci. A lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is actually in this book that's just been, or booklet, brochure, travel guide that's been, but you can't see it. It's published by the International Organization for Migration. It just came out last week, and it's on their website, iom.int, and then you go to the publications, and you can see that. So I'm going to talk about climate change and the linkages to human migration in particular. Just a reminder that people come and people go. This is a picture of an abandoned school in southeastern Alberta, Canada, that was abandoned during the droughts of the 1930s. There we go. But when we talk about climate change and migration, often what we see in the newspaper are these very alarming headlines, people being washed out by rising sea levels and other sorts of natural disasters. And the media has gone so far as to try and identify the first people or places where climate change has caused migration. And these are all over the map, from coastal Alaska to the Canary Islands off the coast of Papua New Guinea to northwestern Africa, where you have the Lake Chad region and the Darfur crisis as well. And some studies have been released in recent years that have tried to pinpoint the number of climate change-related migrations we can expect in coming decades. And the range of predictions is quite high, ranging anywhere from, well, there was a prediction in 2005 to say that we would have 50 million environmental refugees by 2010. I don't know if anyone's actually validated that claim. Others have suggested, Norman Myers, the ecologist, a very well-known suggestion that by a midpoint of this century, 250 million people perhaps. The aid organization Christian Aid, for whom I have a lot of time because they spend a lot of time working with people in distress, has suggested that anywhere up to 1 billion people in the worst case scenario sometime this century. To give you some context of these predictions, the red bar at the far left is the actual number of people who are recognized as refugees by the UNHCR. The other red bar, about 200 million people, is the actual forecasted number of people who are on the move for any reason right now, whether it's voluntary, involuntary, and so on. So you can see that when you compare these projections about climate change, what looks like it could be coming over the horizon is very scary indeed. How accurate are these types of projections? Well, if we look back at historical experience, we know that there's two sorts of climatic events or conditions that can trigger large-scale migrations of people. One set is the sudden onset events, the hurricanes, the extreme storms, and so on. The other are more persistent conditions like drought that unroll or unravel over a number of years and over large areas. Hurricane Katrina obviously brought this to mind a couple of years ago, a good example of a sudden onset event. And if you look at the population trends in New Orleans, you can see 2005 in July there was over 450,000 people living in New Orleans. The following year the population is cut by half by Hurricane Katrina. It is still climbing, but it's still about 100,000 people short of what it was prior to the storm. Go back another decade or so, Hurricane Mitch, which dropped a lot of rainfall on Central America, caused a lot of mudslides, a lot of displacement of people in Honduras and neighboring countries. And these are U.S. immigration statistics for interceptions made at the Mexico-U.S. border of Honduran nationals trying to enter the United States without documentation. And as you can see, between the period of the hurricane in 1988, the following year there was a big spike in intercepts at the border. Now, the numbers came back down the following year, but you can see that the number of Honduran nationals trying to enter the United States that were caught stabilized at a much higher level than prior to the storm. A study that came out last year suggested, looking at immigration statistics to the United States, that when you have a drought in rural Mexico, you actually experience a 2% increase in migration to the United States, one of the first sort of quantitative studies of that. So just a few examples of the types of relationships that we know exist between climate and migration. And when you look into the crystal ball and suggest, well, where are we actually going to see potentially climate change-related migration in the future, you'll see, well, one of the first places is going to be in Canada. because as the sea ice retreats from the north, as mineral and oil resources become revealed, as transportation routes become easier through the Northwest Passage, there will be economic migrants coming in to fill those niches and opportunities. But in other parts of the world, you may see other types of migration. In high latitudes, you may see greater floods. In other areas, you may see greater risk of drought and water scarcity. And then in coastal areas and small island states, not this decade, not the next decade, but starting thereafter, you'll start to see a relationship between changes in sea level and migration out of those areas potentially as well. But one of the things that we have to recognize is that while migration can result from droughts, for example, not all droughts cause migration. It's not a simple cause-effect relationship, stimulus-response. You get differential outcomes in any of these events. And you also get a single climate-related event like Hurricane Katrina can stimulate multiple forms of migration responses. So, for example, you get some people who move away temporarily during an evacuation, then come straight back to their original home. Other people who leave for a year or two and then come back. Others who leave and never come back. And you get people who migrate for the first time to New Orleans to take advantage of new opportunities during the rebuilding effort. Natural scientists tend to talk about the impacts of climate change in the context of a term called vulnerability. And vulnerability in its simplest term is the potential to experience loss or harm, which is the antonym or the opposite of opportunity. And natural scientists tend to break it down into three basic components. One is the nature of the climatic stimulus that people are going to be exposed to in a given place or a given time. The second component is the sensitivity of the human use systems. So, for example, fishing villages are naturally sensitive to changes in fish stocks, which may be affected by ocean conditions. And then the capacity of those people who are exposed to these events. What is their capacity to adapt or adjust and cope with the negative outcomes? This term adaptive capacity is easily illustrated using the idea of drought. You've got two images here, one from northern Nigeria, one from southern Saskatchewan, both semi-arid dryland agricultural regions that experienced drought in the past decade. One area you saw migration responses, and in Saskatchewan you did not. And it's simply because there are different options for adaptation in each of those regions. And that is where sort of migration scholarship and natural science scholarship tends to merge together, is this context of adaptation, where migration can be seen as one of a range of potential human responses to adverse climatic impacts. And it is an adaptation strategy that is used in many parts of the world today. It was once very commonly used in Great Plains of North America. It is typically initiated at the household level, though there are examples of states becoming involved in relocating people. It's not available to everybody who's exposed to negative climatic conditions, and it's not always used by those who might. And in the worst case scenarios, sometimes you just have to undertake migration. So you can see what I'm trying to sketch out here is a very simple sort of systems approach to it, where you have a vulnerable population that could conceivably experience a climate-related stress. Adaptation processes start to take place, and within those you have some that lead to migration and others that do not. And obviously if migration does take effect, then you have a feedback effect, because as the population changes, then the social, economic, and cultural characteristics of the people in places they leave behind, that changes as well. Gives us a bit of a black box though. Why do people migrate under conditions of climatic stress? And this is where our migration scholarship, our migration theories and concepts come into play, because there's a whole range of reasons why people might migrate, whether it's economic opportunity, risk diversification, the influence of macro-scale or global systems, cultural norms, lifestyles, attraction to the big city, love, hate, fear, persecution, all these things. And climate can interact with all of these with, I hope not love. I hope climate change has no impacts on our capacity to love one another, but otherwise all of these sort of human responses can be shaped, influenced, or moderated by our climate. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is that in the media and in the popular attention to these issues, we focus on the absolute worst case scenarios, and we see titles like this on our bookshelves today: global warming, climate wars, the coming anarchy, and so on. But the reality is, and migration scholars who work in the field know this very well, is that the bulk of migration tends to take place over shorter distances within countries, within regions, and so on. It can take on international dimensions when you're talking about climate, but quite often these international movements tend to follow existing or established routes, so following transnational communities, diasporas, and so on. And also, it's usually the case, not always, but usually except in the worst case, that climate alone is not the single factor shaping migration decisions. The other social, economic, and cultural factors are playing into these decisions as well. And this is where a lot of my research tends to focus on these days, is looking at known cases of climate-related migrations to look for lessons and insights that we can use to better enhance our understanding of sort of these systemic connections between environment and human well-being. And so I'm just going to very quickly summarize a few bullets from research that's been going on for a number of years now, not just myself but others. What are some of the factors that shape migration under conditions of climatic stress? One is, well, the actual nature of the stimulus itself, whether it's a rapid onset event, whether it's a high magnitude, high scale event, and what is the capacity or ability of institutions to shape or moderate the impacts on the population that's exposed. At the household level, wealth does play into these things. Things like land tenure are very important. People who do not have secure land tenure are inherently predisposed to migrate, whereas people who have secure land tenure and own fixed property are actually predisposed not to migrate because they have a vested interest in trying to resist migration and adapt through other means. Social capital, social networks, very important. It appears time and time again in research on climate-related migration. It's that strong local networks, strong communities, good institutions at the local level discourage out-migration and facilitate adaptation through other means. Whereas geographically extensive social networks that we often find in transnational communities and so on, they can help shape and facilitate longer distance migration out of regions at stress. At the household level, basic economic, social, cultural, physical factors influence migration decisions. Again, people of advanced age, people in poor health, people from broken families tend to have less ability and less flexibility in their movements, whereas young, educated people with transferable skills, they're going to be more predisposed to migrate. And in some cultural groups, there may be particular members of society who are also encouraged to move. Also, the local physical characteristics vary from one place to another and are highly influential in determining, or not determining, but shaping migration outcomes. I'll give you a very simple example. 2009, in June, there was a drought in southern Saskatchewan. This is a farmer's field 5 kilometers north of Swift Current. It's irrigated. You can see there's a healthy crop there. The soil is good, has a lot of good clay and nutrients in it. Continue about 25 kilometers farther north, and you've got sandy soils that don't support agriculture during a drought. And this particular site has actually been abandoned several times over the years by farmers who try to make a living on this land and can't whenever there's a drought. You see that little green triangle with the coming out of it. That is an earthen dam that a farmer tried to build in the 1930s to store meltwater in behind it. All it did was store enough water to grow crops on the dam itself, but not on the surrounding countryside. So when we look into the crystal ball, who are the types of people in societies around the world who are more likely to become migrants under worst-case climate change scenarios and so on? Well, those who are more likely to migrate are the young, the healthy, the educated, the skilled. Often it's the middle class. In some situations, it'll be the working class or the rural poor, often in the case of rural poor related to land tenure issues, and people with family ties elsewhere. Those who are less likely to migrate, you sort of get the upper and lower end of socioeconomic spectrums here. You get the wealthier groups who have fixed assets, who are going to adapt through other means and have a predisposed interest in staying behind, and then the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum who don't enjoy those strong social networks, cultural networks, and economic means that can help them resist, that give them more options on what they can do. So they may want to migrate, but may be stuck in the places where they are. So just to sort of get towards the conclusions of my talk then, is that what the scholarship today can say about the linkages between climate and migration. Well, what we do know from experience is that climate can and sometimes does influence migration decisions. But migration tends to take place within the context of other sorts of decisions and adaptation options that occur. It often occurs at local, intranational, intra-regional scales. When it goes international, it follows established networks. And we are able now, through a growing body of research, to start to identify some of the factors that interact with climate to shape migration. Where the scholarship is going now is